Dusk clamped over Ash Hollow like a lid. I rode slow, brim low, the roan's hooves scuffing tired dust. I wasn't looking for trouble or company. I kept to the trough side, thinking only of coffee, and the empty chair in my cabin. Then the sack. Moved. I'd taken it for refuse, a burlap bag gone soft with rot, slumped where the trough's overflow made a muddy cradle. It twitched again, a small, certain shiver that couldn't be wind. The horse shied. I slid down and crouched. The knot was sloppy done fast by hands that didn't want to linger on what they'd left. I loosened the tie. Warmth breathed up. Not a coyote kit, not a pup, a face. Red as a burn, eyes glued with sleep, mouth opening without sound. A baby. For a second all I heard was the little thing's breath and my own. My hands remembered the weight of my girl at 3 days old, the squeak she made before she found her cry. The memory of her and of losing her hit like hot iron. I should have looked for the mother. I should have called the sheriff. That's what the town would say. I reached instead. Look at Boon. A voice carried like a thorn. Can't. Ride past a curse without courting it. Sheriff Dalton Crow stood 10 paces off with 2 deputies and a few townsfolk. Crow wore the smile of a starving dog thinking about your hand. It's moving, a deputy said, half curious, half pleased. It's choking on sin, Crow told him, louder for the onlookers. Town's been souring all summer, and there's your reason a sackborn omen. Leave it be, Boon. Don't go making what's crooked your burden. The baby found enough air for a sawed-off trail of need that cut straight through me. I felt my wife's hand on mine and a memory I'd sworn not to touch, then the space where our little girl's breath used to be. My knees wanted to quit. I stood because if I stayed crouched, grief would topple me. You hearing me? Crow asked. We got rules for pests. Calves born wrong. Litters with no mother. We don't keep what won't live. I didn't answer. I slid one arm under the sack, the other across the baby's back the way I'd done when my girl was leaves and bones delicate. Heat came through thin skin into my palm. The tiny chest quivered. I tucked the burlap to keep the breeze off. My horse flicked an ear, patient. Boon. The sheriff spoke my name like a dare. I said. I swung into the saddle with the child held careful against my shirt, the burlap's scratch making a small nest of sound between my heart and his. Ear. The roan collected herself like she'd been waiting for the cue. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, not because I was brave, but because if I looked right or left at that crowd, I'd start swallowing their fear and choke before I cleared the street. Crow paced a step with us. You think mercy is free? He said, softer. Mercy's a tax the weak pay until they lose the land. I eased the horse forward. No one blocked me. Crow didn't either. He let me pass so he could tell the story later, how he'd warned me, and I'd chosen my ruin. I rode out of Ash Hollow with night settling in my hat and a child's breath against my chest, and I did not look back. The north wind followed me home and tried the latch as I shut the door. My cabin didn't have much dull stove, a scarred table, my coat folded on the one chair. On the mantel, a tin frame held what I had left, my wife turning toward a joke, our girl blurred mid-laugh. I set the burlap on the table and steadied my breath. Heat and tremble lived inside. I opened the knot and eased him out small as a rabbit, skin flushed and tight. I warmed water in a tin cup and wet a clean cloth. No flooding. The old midwife's lesson came back whole. I touched his lips just enough to show the river its bed. He worried the damp like he meant to relearn living. The room smelled of wood smoke and fear leaving a body. He grew heavier in my arms, trusting gravity again. I wrapped him in the least threadbare blanket and tucked the burlap around it, a nest made of what I had. When he gave a stubborn little protest, I almost laughed. I shifted him until his ear found my heartbeat. There's something to keep. Hoofbeats came soft into the yard, then a knock. 3 modest taps asking permission to exist. I opened the door. A hand's width Pastor Ezra stood with his hat in both hands and a bottle of milk wrapped in newsprint. Wind had pared him down to rails and hinges. His cough had a church echo. He looked past me to the bundle. His face settled into something between prayer and sorrow. "So it's true," he said. "They're already saying you rode out with a crying sack and the curse of August under your arm." "It wasn't the sack," I said, letting him in, "and he's not crying now." We warmed the milk and tore a strip from an old shirt. Ezra held the bottle. I steadied the child. The boy latched like a man at a doubtful well, drawing in a thin, fierce rhythm that argued with dying. "You know what Crow will make of this," Ezra said. "I can imagine. He's already revising scripture floods, famines, sins of fathers. Men hear what justifies their hands." The boy paused to breathe and fisted my shirt. Something in me that had paced for 2 years lay down. I didn't trust it. I let it. "Rest anyway. I can bring more milk," Ezra said, "or trouble by being seen doing it. Ash Hollow calls mercy a curse when it needs a reason to harden." "I don't need them to call it anything," I said. "I need him to keep breathing." He nodded like I'd recited a creed. He turned the tin frame toward the table careful, so the old light fell on the new. We stood while the boy finished. Outside, the wind worried the eaves dot at the door. Ezra paused. "If you mean to keep him, you won't do it quietly," he said. "Crow will make a doctrine of your ruin. My voice is small, but I'll spend it." "Enough?" For a start, I told him. "Tonight I need your silence more than your sermon." He gave me both. His cough faded down the path. When the kettle ticked itself empty, I banked the fire and laid the boy in the middle of the bed no one had shared since the cholera. I kept his name to myself. A promise feels truer before it's spoken. I sat and listened, breath threaded to mine. The cabin became a held note. My grief hadn't vanished. It steadied its back under something small and living and heavy enough to keep. The days stretched by the size of his breaths. Time filled with smaller weather, kettle, rattle, bottle, gulps, warm wrist checks. I walked grooves into the floor and boiled linens till the steam made its own ghost. When he slept on my chest, the old ache rose and then laid down. Rumor fattens when water thins. The creek showed its stones, cattle chewed dust, and folks needed blame. Sackborn, men said. Bad blood, women murmured outside the mercantile. I stepped in for flour, and felt bodies tilt, the air making room as if I dragged weather in. A girl asked if I carried a curse. Her mother hushed her. The silence stung. Small mercies kept their own count. A loaf sat one morning on my step under a strip of calico no name, still warm. That afternoon Tully, a town drunk, took off his hat and said, solemn as a deacon, "Don't let 'em name him for you, Boon." Then he walked away straighter than he came. Ezra brought milk after dark, coughing into his sleeve so the sound wouldn't carry. "I'll stand in daylight when you need it," he said. "Quiet now, so the help gets through." Doubt worked. Like grit in a boot. When the boy wailed and I was thin myself, I could hear Crow's doctrine under the floorboards, signs and punishments, drought as ledger. Then the boy's hand would find my thumb and hold it like a claimed stake, or he'd burp like a mule, and the house would feel, if not righteous, at least worth sweeping. A man can live on that if he's careful, and I rationed it like a last barrel. On a Wednesday noon I saddled up. I washed him, combed the soft burr of his hair with 2 fingers, and tied the burlap like a coat. I rode down the center of Ash Hollow. I hitched at Turner's and carried the boy in. The bell rang small and honest. Turner looked up, then down, and spoke to his ledger. "What can I do for you, Boon?" "I'm here to order a cradle," I said. A woman by the cloth bolts tightened her mouth. I didn't falter. "A good one," I said. "Rockers that won't squeal, and a quilt I'll pay fair for." Turner's pencil hovered. "You want it when?" "Soon as the carpenter has an hour," I said. "Put it on the board so folks can see the order, and write the name." He finally met my eyes. "What name?" "Jacob," I said, more to the warm weight against my chest than to the man. saying it laid a plank under my boots. Jacob Boon. The woman gasped like a pew creaking. Turner wrote slow, each letter an argument with his hand. When he finished, he tacked the slip to the wall harder than necessary. I paid with coin that had been waiting in a tin since the cholera. On the way out, Deputy Holly leaned in the doorway. "Mamie, it won't make it less of an omen," he said. "Maybe it makes the town more fit for names," I told him, and kept walking. 2 girls watched from the boardwalk. One waved at the bundle. I tipped my hat to their mother and didn't. Mine she didn't tip back. I rode home steady, a man carrying water across brittle ground. The wind shifted cool. The roan flicked her tail. Behind me the bell kept telling whoever wasn't there what I'd done. If mercy is a tax, I'd paid it in public with interest, and learned I could still afford to stand. The wind came up mean, rubbing grit along the clapboards. Jacob slept belly full on the bed, mouth open. I sat with the Winchester I swore I didn't need, oiling habit more than steel. A stone hit, and the window folded with a bird-like cry. Covered the boy and felt the house breathe. Another stone. A bottle burst on the sill, sweet stink sliding down the wall. Voices gathered, organized, quiet. A man read scripture wrong, bending it until it pointed where he wanted. "Purge the leaven," he called. Another, "Cast out the thing born of shame." I set Jacob in the woodbox by the stove, lined it. With my coat slid a warm brick beneath. He protested once, then slept with a fist up. I tied the lid with a strip of cloth roof, not prison, and tucked the box behind the table, out of sight. The Winchester felt heavier than it was. "Don't make me a man I can't stand in the morning," I told the dark. Footsteps crossed the yard. "Kerosene," someone hissed. The smell arrived like a verdict. A torch arced a red line and hit the barn's east wall. Dry boards took fire quick. Light found faces and shamed them. Hats turned down. Men scattered from their own hands. The roan screamed from the lean-to. I loosed her and slapped her into the sage. Wind pushed the flames. Along the roofline, sparks leapt for the cabin eaves. A bucket line of one is still a line. I drew from the well, drew again. The first water hissed and made a mean fog. I climbed the ladder, soaked the shingles, climbed down, filled again. Smoke wrote letters in my throat. "Elias." Ezra came out of the dark, a blanket on. His shoulders a pail in each hand. He moved like a man arguing his body into obedience. We worked without speeches, passing what we had: water, breath, stubbornness. He coughed until it doubled him, then straightened because standing was its own sermon. The barn was always going to lose. We kept the cabin. That felt like the night's bargain, memory for shelter. When the roof sighed and gave, sparks went up like birds changing their minds. Ezra's hand on my arm said stop. We stood in the orange hush. Jacob woke and held his breath between cries the way babies do when the world gets too big. I laid my palm on his chest until he remembered me. His heart bounded, then settled. Ezra looked at the rifle on the table. "You're thinking about an answer," he said. "I'm thinking about 100, I said. "None I can live with tomorrow." "Then keep the only one you can," he said. "Not every weapon is iron." "They'll come again," I said. "Crows." "Doctrine is a pump handle," Ezra answered. "Once men get it going, their arms don't know how to stop." "I'll stand," I said. "I won't shoot unless they mean to put him in the ground." He nodded. "Let that be enough tonight." We watched the barn finish dying. Before bed I turned the tin frame so my wife and girl could see the boy. "We're staying," I told all of them. "We'll stand again in the morning." The wind worried the broken window and then lay down. By August the land had a cough. The creek forgot its song and showed its ribs. Mesquite leaves turned their thin undersides to the sun like supplicants. Jacob, contrary as a weed, thickened in my arms. He learned to laugh at nothing ceiling. Knots the edge of my hat, Ezra's whiskers when the old man dared a grin. It felt like defiance with a pulse. The town needed a villain more than it needed rain. Crow gave them one. He nailed a notice to the courthouse door where weddings and stock auctions used to go. By order of the sheriff, it read in a hand that wanted to be scripture. To preserve the peace and prosperity of Ash Hollow, the sack-born infant kept by Elias Boon shall be removed beyond the township before the next Sabbath. Folks gathered and read it twice like it said more the second time. Some nodded like their necks were on hinges, he owned. He held court that afternoon in the heat. You can smell the curse in the wind, he told them. I warned him. He chose ruin. He chose it for all of us. He pointed toward my ridge, toward the house he'd rather burn legal than torch by night. Mercy's a leak in a canteen, he said. You don't notice until you're choking. Ezra came at dusk with a sack of oats and a face like the end of a hymn. He didn't step in until I said it. He looked at Jacob a long while and set his hand on the door jamb as if to steady the room. Leave, he said, tonight? I asked. Before men who believe they're right decide to prove it, he answered. I can ready a wagon. I know a family 2 days west who'd keep you while this town's fever breaks. What lesson would that be? I said, too sharp, then softened my mouth so the boy wouldn't taste anger in the air. If I run, what does he learn about his worth? That it depends on how loud a man like Crow can shout. He learns that his father chose him over pride, Ezra said, and coughed until the bench took his weight. He learns the living are more use than the dead. I set water on and watched the way the flame tried to climb the blackened kettle, and failed. I promised to keep him breathing, I said. I did not promise to keep him hidden. Ezra looked old enough to crack. A shepherd sometimes carries a lamb because the wolves are organized. I'll carry him, I said, but not out of town like contraband. I poured him coffee, and we sat with the problem between us like a third man. Fear spread quicker than fire. Children were kept inside. Men spit sideways when I passed, like to keep rot from their tongues. Turner would still sell me nails, but his hand shook as if the coins burned. Tully, sober as a judge, walked with me a piece and said, Crows. Got men who can't live with themselves unless they live by his mouth. Then he tipped his hat to Jacob and wandered toward Shade Dot the day before the deadline. Crow rode up with 2 deputies and a crowd that meant to be governance. He didn't. Dismount. Clocks run, he said. You move him, or we move him. He has a name, I said, opening the door so the town could see the cradle they'd paid to ignore, the quilt someone had pieced at midnight and left on my step. Jacob cooed like a creek remembering itself. Jacob Boon. Names don't bind curses, Crow said. His eyes slid to Ezra, who'd taken his place on my porch like a crooked fence post that still kept cattle. Pastor, you going to bless this rebellion? I'm going to bless a child, Ezra replied, voice thin but true. And the men who remember they were one. Crow looked past me at the barn's ash heap and smiled small. You planning to lose the rest of your place for this cause, Boone? I'm planning not to let you teach my son that he's a debt the town can collect, I said. If you believe he's a curse, you come take him yourself, but you'll have to bury me first. Silence has weights. The crowd felt all of them. Deputy Hall shifted in the saddle like his boots didn't fit. A woman behind him wiped her mouth and studied the horizon as if rain were an argument. She might still win. Crow's jaw worked. Sabbath, he said at last. High sun. He's gone by then, or he's gone at my hand. He wheeled the horse and left the dust to do his talking. Ezra closed his eyes. If you mean to stand, make it stand for something more than spite, he said. It'll stand for him, I told him, lifting Jacob so his cheek could learn my stubble. And for every man who's wished someone had stood when he was small. That night I set the cradle by the door. I loaded no rifle. I mended the latch instead, then sat with my back to the jamb and Jacob against my chest, counting his breaths and the reasons not to run. I found more of the second than I liked. I stayed anyway. They came humming like hornets when the nest is close. I dozed with my back to the door and Jacob on my chest, the new latch warm against my shoulder. The first footstep on the stoop snapped me awake. The second pulled a thin cry from the boy. I opened the door wide so no one could say I hid. Lanterns made a shallow pond of light. Faces ringed it. Men I'd mended fence with. Boys I'd shot horses for. Crow wasn't there. His doctrine was held in other men's mouths. Evening. I said, because manners are armor. My boy's trying to sleep. You got until Sabbath, Deputy Halley said, voice thick with borrowed certainty. Some of us don't fancy waiting on curses. Cattle down, wells coughing mud, another added. Crow says a hard choice is still the right one. I let the door frame hold me. Jacob hiccuped himself small and pressed his ear into my chest. The ring shifted. The sound of need can outvote men for a breath or two. You'll have to bury me first, I told them. Softer now. If you come for him, come honest. No rocks. No torches. Just your hands and whatever you call law. A murmur worked through. A kid at the edge shifted from one boot to the other, like he felt his father watching. Ezra came up the path, with no cloak but his thinness. He stayed a step down, eye level with the worst of them. If you intend to measure curses, he said, start with the ones you speak over your own names. I've buried children in good weather, and blessed men who blame storms on anything but their own thirst. Pastor, a man warned, you of all people should fear what we fear. I fear cowardice made into policy, Ezra said. I fear boys learning that a town's strength lies in how small it can make it smallest. The wind went through the cottonwoods and came back with nothing. A woman by the gate wiped her nose with the side of her hand and looked at Jacob. Knowing and ashamed to say so, Deputy Halley squinted. Boon, put down the gun. I haven't picked one up, I said, showing them my empty hands. One under my son, one open to receive. You get a different man when I hold iron. You don't want him, I don't either. Standing won't make rain, someone muttered. Maybe it'll keep us human enough to deserve it. Ezra said, We stood in that small silence a long minute. A lantern guttered. The dark that replaced it felt less like a threat than a favor. How? Looked at the mended lintel, at Jacob, at Ezra's shaking hands, at his own boots. Sabbath, he said at last. It didn't sound like a sentence anymore. It sounded like a word a man has to carry to bed. One by one they peeled away, careful, not to meet each other's eyes so they wouldn't catch what was softening. Ezra climbed the step and leaned his shoulder to mine until our tremors matched. You're not winning, he whispered. I'm not trying to, I said. I'm remembering how not to lose. I shut the door gently. The latch held. I set Jacob in the cradle and laid my hand across his ribs, also to quiet myself. Outside, boots creaked where men remembered they had homes. Inside, the lamp burned small, steady. I kept my watch without metal, the line drawn at the threshold, and in me both. Sunday drew itself thin and bright, the kind of sky that pretends it never learned what clouds are for. I saddled the roan and rode in with Jacob against my chest, his fingers investigating the edge of my shirt like a cartographer. Ezra met me, halfway up the street, breath hitching, hat in both hands. He didn't ask if I was sure. Men who've already burned a barn don't need to be asked twice. The church steps held the last of the morning shade. Folks drifted in along the boardwalks, curiosity pretending to be piety. I climbed 2 risers, enough to see the faces I'd been living against. Turner with his ledger jaw. Holly trying to square his uniform with his stomach. Tully sober, hat. Neat. The 2 little girls from the mercantile stood with their mother, who had not forgiven me for ordering a cradle in daylight. She didn't pull them back. I set my canteen on the step and unscrewed the cap. I had no Bible and no iron. I had the boy and the water I'd carried myself. This child was put down where a man empties his horse, I said, loud enough for men at the back to pretend they heard by accident. I found him because I could not ride past. I don't ask your leave to keep him. I ask your witness. I lifted Jacob so he could see the sky, and maybe the town if he cared to. "His name is Jacob Boon," I said, and the plank under my boots thickened. I wet my palm and let the water run from my hand across his forehead, cool and bright. "You were not made a curse," I told him, not whispering. "You were made a promise I intend to keep." Ezra's wheeze became a yes. A hush gathered that wasn't fear. It was attention, plain and human. The horses parted at the end of the street. Crow rode in with his hat low and his righteousness high, the crowd making way like a bruise. He stopped even with the church gate, one boot still in the stirrup. "You greet the Sabbath with a crime," he called. "I told you to remove the thing." "This is a child," I said. "If you can't hear the difference, I'm done with your kind of listening." Crow's mouth sharpened. He drew his revolver and let the sun find it. "Order isn't made with pretty words," he said. "It's made with the courage to pull a trigger when the town needs you to." Ezra stepped up between us like an old tree no one remembered planting. "Order isn't fear with a badge," he said, each word bought with a cough. "It's the law we keep when nobody's watching." "You're out of sermons, preacher," Crow snapped. He raised the gun and fired into the air. The crack tore the quiet and left raw edges. Jacob flinched, then grabbed my shirt with a fury I recognized. Smoke shredded and drifted. No rain fell. Nobody ran. Tully didn't move. Turner's pencil stayed where it was behind his ear. The girl's mother put a hand over her mouth and then lowered it slow, like she was tired of her own caution. "Deputy." Hale's hand hovered near his own holster and then fell useless to his side. "Put it down, Dalton," I said. "Not a dare. A request the size of a life. You aimed that at a man with a baby. You don't get to call yourself strong. You get to call yourself frightened." "You don't get to teach me words," he said, but he was looking at the crowd to see if he still owned them. That was when authority started leaking out of him. Slow as a punctured canteen, Ezra put his thin body across my line, a shield made of coughs and stubbornness. "If you want the child," he said, "you start with me." Crows. Second shot didn't come. He pushed the revolver back into leather like a man reconsidering whether he'd meant to draw at all. The street breathed. Hallie cleared his throat and faced his own boots. Somewhere a door opened and didn't close again. I lifted Jacob once more, water still bright on his brow. "Jacob Boon," I said, so the name would have a house to live in, made of breath and noise and small, holy need. A woman, maybe the one who'd left the calico loaf, said "Amen" without meaning to. Ezra cried without sound. Crow put his hat back on slow and realized the brim didn't fit the way it had that morning. He turned his horse. He didn't bless us with a parting threat. He left absence where he'd planned on leaving fear. When the bell rang for service, no one told me to step down. No one asked me to leave the steps. Folks filed past the sheriff's shrinking shadow and brushed the boy's blanket with the backs of their fingers like men touch a relic when they don't have a prayer ready. No one told me to leave the steps. I picked up the empty sack and tied it to the roan saddle horn, a plain flag of what I refused to forget. Jacob settled against my chest, damp brow cooling under my palm. The crowd opened not with fear, but with a kind of embarrassed courtesy, the way men make room for a woman carrying pails. Hats tipped without names attached. The two girls from the mercantile reached to touch the edge of his blanket. Their mother didn't stop them. Turner cleared his throat and said to no one in particular, "Cradle's ready." "I'll bring it." "Up myself." Tully nodded solemnly like we were burying a secret, and said nothing at all. Crow stood 20 yards off, still astride, still sheriff by the paper on his chest, but smaller inside his coat. He saw the sack tied neat as a brand, and decided he didn't want to read it. I watched him measure his horse like it might move the town for him if he spurred hard enough. It wouldn't. I looked between us and found his own hands empty. That, more than anything, seemed to frighten him into honesty. I didn't give a speech. I rode. Ezra fell in beside me on foot, thin shadow keeping pace, breath counting mercy out loud. At the edge of the street he stopped, set his hand on my knee, and said, choose it again tomorrow. That was all. He turned back toward his church with the walk of a man who'd spent himself and was glad of what he'd bought. The ridge wind met us like a familiar ache. Where the barn had been was a low black thought. I led the roan past it, tied her by the lean-to, and carried Jacob inside. I set him in his cradle, the one Turner hadn't yet delivered, the one a stranger's midnight quilt tried to become, then nailed a strip of rawhide where the window had failed and cut fresh slats for a shutter. I hung the burlap on a nail by the door. When it swung, it sounded like a page turning. Neighbors didn't arrive with confetti. They came with shyness. Before sundown, a sack of beans appeared on the step, then a tin of salve. Turner trudged up with the cradle on his back, sweating a labor he called overdue inventory. The quilt maker never named herself, but she stitched her apology into the corners with thread that wouldn't quit. Even Holly rode by at dusk and tipped his hat without words. He had the look of a man who understood that following orders had nearly made him a stranger to his own kitchen table. Crow didn't come that night. I knew better than to believe in an ending that tidy. Men like him don't dissolve. They shrink and look for lower ground. But a town that had been swallowing its fear all summer finally gagged on it, and some of it came up. That's a beginning to. Ezra came late, jacket over his arm, cough worse from the morning's courage. He sat with me on the step and watched. Jacob sleep with his mouth open like he was drinking air. No miracles today, he said. Just men remembering which words belonged to them. Miracles are built, I answered. Bad ones are too. We didn't talk about the barn. We talked about fence posts and winter oats and how deep a man should set his cornerstones when he plans to stay. Ezra said grace over coffee, and I realized he meant the whole of it, not the cup. When he'd gone, I carried Jacob to the mantel and showed him the tin frame, his mother that wasn't and sister that wasn't, smiling into a light I still kept polished. You don't replace anything, I told him. You don't have to. Your job is to be noisy and hungry and alive. He yawned like a yes. I kissed the warm place where his hair starts and felt my grief not vanish, but take a new shape, one that fit in a man's chest without tearing it. I lay down with the cradle by the door and the burlap tapping the wall in the wind. I slept as men sleep who have chosen their trouble on purpose. In the morning, if Crow found a new scripture or an old torch, we'd meet it at the threshold with the same answer. Not with iron, unless iron came through first. With witness. With Ezra's thin body, if he had any hours left to stand. With Tolly's sober hat. With Turner's ledger jaw. With two girls who had learned the weight of names by brushing a blanket and not being punished for it. Mercy isn't a mood. It's a practice. It costs. I would pay again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, because blessings aren't found in sacks or handed down by men on horses. They're made by hands that lift what other hands drop, and by towns that decide their smallest lives are worth more than their biggest fears.